Everyone. My name is Laurie Gagan with MainStreetMediaUtah.com. And I'm here today as the Wellness Crusaders, your co-host for this evening, where I will be interviewing Dr. Richard Fleming, lead contributor to 10letters.org, which we will be talking about later on our show. Dr. Fleming is the author of Stop Inflammation Now, one of my personal favorite books that he wrote back in 1994. His newest book, Are We the Next Endangered Species? Bioweapons, Eugenics, and More, we will also be talking about. Dr. Fleming is the author of Is COVID-19 a Bioweapon?, which is a must-have book for everyone wanting to understand how and where the deadly disease known as COVID-19 got its first start. Dr. Fleming's theory became part of the cardiology textbook in 1999. He spoke at the American Heart Association, where he introduced his theory on inflammothrombotic response, which we all know as inflammation. Dr. Fleming's research into SARS-CoV-2 began around 1999 when he first started researching gain of function, which was funded by the U.S. Department of Health. Dr. Fleming has spent decades of his time graciously giving his own time to educate the world on the knowledge about gain of function research. But before we bring him in, I just want to give a few disclaimers that our listeners understand that the role of a health coach is not to prescribe or assess micro and macro nutrient levels, to provide healthcare, medical, or nutritional therapy services, or to diagnose, treat, or cure any disease, condition, or other physical or mental ailments of the human body. Rather, the coach is a mentor and a guide who has been trained in holistic health coaching to help clients sustain lifestyle changes in a positive way. The listener understands that we are not acting in the capacity of a doctor, a licensed dietitian, nutritionist, psychologist, or any other licensed or registered professional, and that any advice given by the coach is not meant to take the place or advice by any of these professionals. If the listener is under care of a healthcare professional or currently using prescription medications, the client should discuss any dietary changes or potential dietary supplement use with his or her doctor and should never discontinue any prescription medication without first consulting his or her doctor. So before we get started, Leighton is going to play just a short video of what Dr. Fleming presented to the Slovakian government. So Leighton, if you could play that video, I'd appreciate it.
Hello, my name is Dr. Richard Fleming. I'm a PhD, MD, JD in the United States of America. I've been a physicist for 50 years, a physician for 38, and an attorney for 10. Throughout my career, I've been actively involved in trying to figure out what causes inflammothrombotic response diseases like heart disease, strokes, high blood pressure, diabetes, cancer, miscarriages, and a variety of other illnesses. I've been actively involved in trying to figure out why they occur, how we can diagnose them, and how we can best treat them. As a result, 4.5 years ago, when SARS-CoV-2/COVID-19 hit the scenes, I became actively involved in the investigation and research of these bioweapons and the eugenic genetic vaccines. The plenipotentiary, Dr. Peter Cutler, has asked me to provide materials for the 14 of you, the Congress of Slovakia, as well as Mr. Robert Fico, your Prime Minister, to discuss the topics of the origins of these viruses, the eugenic genetic vaccines, and the World Health Organization / international health rules and regulations. To that end, I have assembled 2 different video presentations, one on the origins and one on the eugenic genetic vaccines. Included within that as material on the WHO international health rules and regulations. I have also provided 2 PDFs, one of a book known as Is COVID-19 a Bioweapon? A Scientific and Forensic Investigation, and the other, Are We the Next Endangered Species? Bioweapons, Eugenics, and more. It's been my pleasure to care for several presidents of the United States, 1 vice president, and a number of members of Congress. To that end, I've had people ask me very specifically if Donald J. Trump is reelected as president, becomes the 47th president of the United States, would I be willing to be the 26th Secretary of Health and Human Services? And I've agreed to do that should Donald Trump ask me to be his Secretary of Health and Human Services. This is a position that will require someone with a science, medical, and law background and training to address. I've provided a document for Dr. Peter Kotler to share with you on the 20 points that I would actively pursue as Secretary of HHS. Included in that is the investigation, indictment, and prosecution of Americans involved in the funding and development of the SARS-CoV-2 bioweapon. Also included is the action that I would take as Secretary of HHS to immediately withdraw the eugenic genetic vaccines being used for COVID-19 from the American market. And I would also advise President Trump to revoke any agreements made in 2024 within the international health regulations and the current actions before the UN, where efforts are being made to usurp the power and authority of several nations, including the United States and Slovakia. It is my hope that the materials provided give you clarity so that you will have the courage to call for the investigation of the Americans through the US government responsible for developing these bioweapons, that you will withdraw these eugenic genetic vaccines from the Slovakian population, stopping the harm and injury occurring to Slovakians, particularly your children, and to stand firm in your resolution to not sign the 2024 IHR and to go further with revocation of any presumed actions by the UN, giving them authority over your country. It's been my pleasure to work with Dr. Kotler. It will be my pleasure to work with President Trump. It will be my pleasure to assist the Slovakian government in efforts where Slovakia and the United States may work together to restore the sovereignty of our nations, to protect our citizens, and to keep foreign nations, foreign authorities out of the healthcare of Slovakian and American citizens. Thank you.
So I'm going to bring Dr. Fleming in once again. Dr. Fleming, can you hear me?
Yes, I can. How are you?
I'm quite honored again to be interviewing you on something so many of us have been watching really around the world because it has to do with the Slovakian government. And unfortunately for me, I live in America, and it seems like Slovakia is steps ahead of where we hoped and prayed that America would be. So let's get started because I know we have a lot to talk about. I want to just ask a couple of basic questions for any of our new listeners that are listening in to our show. So can you tell us what inflammothrombotic disease is?
Yes, anytime something comes into your body, and mostly it's something that shouldn't be there, although it can be in excess of something that you normally might have. For example, cholesterol, where it plays a positive role, but too much can play a negative role. The reality is your body's immune system reacts to it. And when our immune system recognizes something as being too much or just foreign to the body, it sets up a whole series of pathways, one that causes chemicals to be released that causes tissue swelling or inflammation, and another set of chemicals that tries to wall up the area by forming blood clots, which is all back up behind me in that big diagram behind me. So it's an inflammatory thrombotic response. A lot of people just call it inflammation. Um, I'm hoping that eventually we'll get past that where people will say inflammatory thrombotic, because there was a time that Americans didn't even use the term inflammation. So I think people around the world are smart enough to learn a new term. We learn new terms all the time, and to fully understand that there's a couple different things going on. It's inflammation and blood clotting. The inflammation tries to kill off the area. The blood clotting tries to wall it off. So it again tries to kill it off by starving it of nutrients and to keep it from getting out, whatever that might be.
Okay, that's a perfect answer. Thank you for that. So in your book that you recently wrote on eugenics, you talked about in the second chapter, which again, I absolutely love that book. I'm not all the way through it, but I'll tell you what, chapter 2 was very enlightening to me. I mean, I've always been awake, but chapter 2 gave me a lot more detail on really what's been happening with eugenics. But you wrote about Adolf Hitler considering the US the shining example of what eugenics could achieve.
Mhm.
So, with that said, can you just explain what is gain of function?
So gain of function is one way, but not the only way, in which you take a living organism, and we've been talking about the SARS-CoV-2 virus as the classic example that people are learning about this with, and you do something to change it that enhances its ability to either infect or to cause harm. In some instances, it does both. In some instances, you try to do that and it does the exact opposite, which would be considered a failure. But the function is to build something scientifically that changes what might naturally occur into something more effective and more damaging. And there's this duality principle. Depends upon whether you're using it for good or bad. The argument for good was, golly, we'll stay a step ahead of what's going on, and then if something comes up, we'll be able to address it. But a step ahead is where you tweak something in a minor way that is reasonable to expect that it could change. If you change it too much, you're basically making a change that would not be expected on the planet for hundreds or thousands of years. And normally what every living organism does, including people, is we adapt. We see something new, we adapt to it. We see something new, we adapt to it. Well, if you've launched something genetically that couldn't possibly have this many changes for hundreds or thousands of years, basically what you've done is you've said you're not giving time for the people, because we're the ones targeted because of the structure of this thing. Although some other animals can get infected, it's primarily a human problem. You don't give us enough time to adapt, which would be the equivalent of us landing on another planet where they have infectious diseases and being exposed to something that we're not ready for. Or maybe as a more relative example, it was the Europeans bringing smallpox to the Americas in the 1600s, 1700s. This was not something that the native people of America had ever seen before, and it almost wiped them out. I mean, it was extremely devastating to the American populations because they had no prior exposure to anything like it at all.
Okay. And again, in your book, Are We the Next Endangered Species? You talk about in 1935, you talk about the Nuremberg Law, but it just seems that us as endangered species, it's been going on since the beginning of time. So now you're finally writing about the history of where eugenics, genetics, and more came into place. So tell us a little bit about how does the Nuremberg Law apply to the gain of function bioweapon?
So just as a minor correction, Nuremberg was actually 1945, not the 1930s. And it got its name because it was Nuremberg, Germany, where the trials were being held at. So when Nazi Germany was defeated, if we can consider it actually defeated, given the rest of the information in the book, and we were trying Nazi war criminals in Nuremberg, one of the arguments that the Germans came up with, the Nazis came up with, was you can't try us for doing what we did because your doctors did the same thing, which is true. I mean, the American doctors, the Japanese doctors, the Chinese doctors, the Italians, the French, everybody was doing the same thing. We don't like to think about that because everybody wants to say we're good and they're bad, right? But what happened was the attorneys at Nuremberg realized, yeah, the Germans had a good defense. And so a couple physicians got together and wrote a code about what should happen, what the rules should be. And they wrote out basically 10 different principles about rules that should apply for doctors treating patients. You know, what types of safeguards should there be? And there's been several things like the Belmont Report and the Helsinki Accord and a variety of rules and regulations that have followed on the Nuremberg Code. But they were able to use those rules to the benefit to convict many of them. But bear in mind, one of the points I make in the book is Dr. Blum was one of the German scientists, physicians from the Nazi concentration camp that was being tried at Nuremberg. And this man experimented on twins. He did aerosolized vaccines. He dropped anthrax on US troops and Russian troops. And the United States went in and got him off. He got acquitted. And then we brought him to the US and had him continue his work for the US government. So, you know, it raises a lot of serious questions about the motives of the US and other countries, because we brought more than 3,000 of them out and put them in our military and our science and our medical fields and said, continue to do your research, you know. Now, Nuremberg set of codes, it's not the law of the land of the United States. It is interesting that Jennifer Bridges, in her case in the Southern Federal District of Texas, where she was trying to address Methodist healthcare workers here in Houston who got fired because they refused to take the vaccines that were mandated. And even though she's lost every one of her efforts of putting this through the courts, one of the interesting things that did come out of that is that the judge who heard her case, and the case of all the other than Methodist plaintiffs, said it didn't apply, that Nuremberg did not apply because Methodist Hospital is not the government, right? And that's a very important thing. I mean, even in that lost case that she's doing, there is an answer that was provided in a federal court, which is this federal judge said it didn't apply to Methodist because Methodist isn't the government. Well, that's a significant point considering what the U.S. government has been involved in, because that now is a federal judge saying Nuremberg applies to the federal government. And that's, I think, an uncomfortable position for our federal government to be in, because it means when we do get there and prosecute them, we can pull Nuremberg up, but we're not going to have a Nuremberg 2. That Nuremberg 1 was bad enough. We prosecuted a couple of dozen and brought 3,000 out and put them around the world. That's not what I consider a success. That's what I consider a disaster. So the Nuremberg Code simply says you have to do certain things. You can't just randomly experiment upon people. They have to have an idea. There have to be certain safeguards. If they're prisoners, if they're mentally deficient, if a variety of things, standards have to be there. People have to know. I mean, you don't get a diagnostic test in the United States without somebody telling you, here's the risk and the reason why you're doing it. That's the classic informed consent component of that argument. But it also, the American Medical Association has that requirement. The Belmont Report has that. The Helsinki Accord has that. So this is not new. But the real crimes that have been committed here are the development of a biological weapon, which violates the 1975 Biological Weapons Treaty, the 1989 Anti-Terrorism Act, the 2012 18 U.S.C. Section 175. All of that has been violated in federal code. And, then the sub-code crimes by state law are murder, attempted murder, assault, battery, a variety of crimes like that. And that's what 10 letters is all about, is to put enough pressure on the attorney generals that they have to act. They have to look at it. If I didn't have the material that made the case, they could look at it and throw it out the window. But the reality is that I think they've been listening long enough. They've listened to myself. They know what I have. They know what what Karen has. They know what Rixie has. They know what Deinert has. They know what Huff has. There's 6 other people they don't know the materials that I have from these people that will document drugs being stolen from patients that were prescribed, people that were respiratory therapists who didn't follow the orders of the doctors on how to adjust the ventilators and people died, military personnel that we have their physical qualifications for their standard skills, physical performances pre and post, both infection and vaccination. So we have all that data that I haven't even talked about because I'm protecting those things. But that data is going to come out when we get to this.
Okay. I think it's sad that we're 5 years into this and there hasn't been any convictions yet here in the United States. And there are several Congress people who have been coming out and talking about it, but 5 years into it, to me, it seems like a pretty lengthy amount of time because I've had a lot of people pass in those 5 years.
Yes, we're at 58. We're at 58 months. We're 2 months short of 5 years. And I've told people from the beginning I was going to do this methodically. I wasn't going to jump, at claims. I needed data. I needed evidence. And I also said I would go wherever I had to go to get this done. And, it's ironic, I think, that Slovakia is the place that we're going to get this done because they were Eastern Bloc after World War II. They are not pro-American because, let's be honest, the United States did a really good job of not only bringing Nazis out after World War II, but we did a really good job of alienating a lot of people, which made it possible for Russia to become the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics, the USSR, which is not a term most people probably have even heard of now. Sadly, I think as I get older, terms that I'm familiar with, other people may not have even heard. But, those Eastern Bloc nations, which are the eastern part of Europe, which is Poland and Czechoslovakia, which is now Chechnya, or the Czech Republic, and Slovakia, and Hungary, and the rest of those countries, they still have strong doubts about Americans, but it was only because the British, the French, the Germans, and the Czechs had reached forward to me and to Professor Luc Montagnier, and then I reached out also to Dr. Kevin McCarran in Japan to ask him if he wanted to be part of that, for us to get the international criminal case organized that led to the Slovakians reaching out earlier this year to me, asking for evidence that I had materials to address the origins of the viral bioweapons, to address the effect of these eugenic genetic vaccines, to address the international health regulations of 2024 from the WHO. And right now, Slovakia is the only country that has rejected the IHR. And they are under huge pressure from the European Union, where the EU is basically stating Slovakia is an embarrassment to the EU for not signing on the IHR. So at this point in time, I think it's very important to recognize, first, the Prime Minister of Slovakia, Robert Fico, and the plenipotentiary, the man who was put in charge of this investigation for Slovakia, Dr. Peter Kotler, for both of them standing up against a huge resistance from the European Union, as well as the scientific community in Slovakia and the medical community in Slovakia, many of whom are still trying to say they didn't do anything wrong by doing this. Those two gentlemen have stood up. They have some others with them, but they have stood up where others cowered down. And that speaks very highly of these two gentlemen, of the integrity that they have, of their interest in their country. They understand. They have said that they would like to see Donald Trump, if he's elected again as now the 47th president, to have me as Secretary of Health and Human Services to apply these same changes in the United States. They see a potential very strong relationship for U.S.-Slovakian relationship that has not been there since pre-World War II. And they are very instrumental right now in negotiating with the Ukraine on peace deals with the Ukraine and Russia. It is Slovakia that is working with the Ukraine directly to negotiate a peace to cease this war between the Ukraine and Russia. And that is something that comes with this work that I'm doing with these gentlemen, that would be of great benefit to President Trump and great benefit to bringing peace to the world. These men have stepped forward to do the hard task that they could have just turned a blind eye to, like so many others, but they have come forward to do the right thing for their people and the rest of the people on the planet.
So, with what you just said, then I have a follow-up question. So you were presenting the data. How long and how did it lead to them really realizing the potential harms that had been caused by the COVID-19 bioweapon to the citizens of their country?
I'm sorry, could you repeat that? Somebody had put a message up here.
Oh,
sorry.
That's okay. So you started working with them, with the Slovakian government. You presented the data of the years and years of the research that you have done. how long did it take for, I guess, the light bulb to go on and for them to realize about the harms of COVID-19 as a bioweapon to their citizens and the damage it was doing to their country?
So it's a lot like a lot of the conversations I have with people. You know, I remember doing the Crimes Against Humanity tour, sitting in a taxi in Los Angeles, going from one airport to the other, and talking to the taxi cab driver. Just one a number of examples. He knew something was wrong, but he couldn't prove it. And after, you know, long enough drive and me talking about different things, he was able to say, "Of course, this makes perfect sense. Now I have the data." This is what was going on in Slovakia too. These gentlemen knew something was wrong. They didn't have the evidence to prove it. They didn't have the information to prove it. So fortunately, since the Czechs were involved in the ICC case that was filed, and by the way, that is still an active open case for the International Criminal Court. That has not been completely shut down. They've done a great job of ignoring it, but it's still there, kind of like the thorn in the side or the paw of a lion. It really, in the spring of 2024, April, May, when Dr. Kotler first reached out to me, and they were already getting materials that I had sent. They were developing a better understanding. But then I put together a presentation for June of 2024, where Dr. Kotler was getting ready to present this, and he asked if anybody else wanted to. There was only one other example of somebody who kind of he got the information in. It was late, but I still sent it forward. There were a couple other people that provided evidence that kind of fell short, but he had, Fico and Kotler had presented it in June, and now we're basically exposed and needed to go back and get more information. And then in September of this year, last month, they began asking a lot more information. They've been watching a lot more of the material, including material that we've done together, that they've seen. And I put together then, so the first one was about 45 minutes long, and the second was about an hour and 45 minutes long, addressing the origins, addressing the eugenic genetic vaccines, addressing the international health regulations. And as you heard in that introductory 5-minute video, that went off to Kotler a couple of days before he presented to the media on the 2nd of October. And that was, he played that 5 minutes for them, and it had Slovakian subtitles so they could understand what I was saying. And then Kotler proceeded to give an hour presentation telling them that he would be presenting to the government. I think around the 8th of October, their Secretary of Health resigned. She stepped down.
Yes, I saw that.
And about the 10th of October, I think it was, one of their radio television stations had a virologist on there, a Dr. Klempa, who basically was saying that this was misinformation, that it was conspiracy, but then he went ahead to make a couple comments. His comments were, there's no way for genetic material to get into DNA. And then he made a comment about, and he used the term prick. So he said, even if a little prick goes here, it won't get to you, it won't have any effect on your children, which I thought was kind of an interesting fallback. That's kind of like, if it could get into your DNA, it just wouldn't get into your children. So in my typical fashion of trying to, I think, be honest and objective and not paraphrase for him, I included a lot of his interview in my response so I could just let people hear what the man said, the virologist said. And then I responded to it. So his 8-minute video turned out to have a 22-minute response by me, where I simply laid out, listen, you may be a virologist, and I don't know how old you are. I think he's 48 and I'm 68, right? And I said, so here's the reality. We know that outside genetic material gets into human DNA. Why do we know that? Well, back in 1980, when I was a medical student, a couple of years later, we heard about this thing known as HIV. And HIV evades our immune system by getting into our DNA. It gets its genetic code into our genetic code and interferes. And it does that primarily in what's known as the CD4 cells. And then I also explained, also in 1980, science discovered something known as long interspersed nuclear elements 1, which is 18% of our DNA, and it only has one purpose, and that's to take outside DNA and to put it into our human DNA. And then there's the third little problem, which is that we have this whole thing called gene therapy, which is the premise that we insert something into human DNA. So 1, 2, 3 strikes, you're out, or in tennis, game, set, match. The virologist, I had just pointed out, here's 3 major reasons why you're wrong. And by the way, if you don't think it travels from the site of injection, let's look at the 2017 Moderna lipid nanoparticle mRNA research that showed that in the animal models that they did, which were male models, the gene therapy, the lipid nanoparticle mRNA gets into the testes of the rat. So if you think it won't potentially get to offspring, then you didn't even look at the 2017 data. So if that's the best they've got, they need to send everybody back to second grade and get refunds on all their degrees in Slovakia. But it's clearly not the best they have in Slovakia, because their prime minister and Dr. Kotler, who's an orthopedic surgeon, get it, right? So on the 15th, Dr. Kotler presented.
Dr. Fleming, can I ask you a quick question?
Sure.
What were the primary shots in Slovakia? Pfizer, Moderna?
So they started off with that, and then they distrusted the U.S. so much that they went to the Russian Sputnik vaccine. Okay. So, that's how much they distrust Americans. They're not looking at me as an American. That they get it. I look at myself as somebody who is determined that what the United States stands for is what we go back to being. And I've talked about this with people a lot recently, as people have talked to me about Trump. And I've said, one of Donald Trump's problems is that I think during his first term, when he heard people say they cared about the United States being what the United States was supposed to be, he took them at their word. And these same people sabotaged him and stabbed him in the back and spent most of his 4 years now on defensive instead of doing what he wanted to do for the country. And that's a problem, because many people who say they're in it for the country aren't in it for the country. They're in it for what they can get out of that position. There's nothing about being Secretary of HHS that I look at as something I'm going to get out of for me. We have a system that was set up to do very good things, and we need to, he likes to say, drain the swamp. I like to refer to it in the Make America Healthy Again analogy, which is we need to take out the weeds. We need to burn the trash. We need to put clean fertilizer out there with clean water without toxins added to it, and expose this country to the sunlight of truth instead of the darkness that we've been living in, and refertilize the benefits of this country for what it was meant to be by the founding fathers. So taking that under consideration, quite frankly, my perspective of being Secretary of HHS is more of a protective instinct, fatherly instinct of Donald Trump and the country than it is my trying to get something out of it. Because I think the country needs to be protected. I think HHS needs to be cleaned up. And I think President Trump needs to be protected as president because he got advice from people who had conflicts of interest with both the weapon that they developed, the virus, and the eugenic genetic vaccines that was profitable for them and allowed them to move forward on some of their other plans. And he took them at their word. And they lied to him. They used him, and he doesn't have the science background. And you wouldn't ask me to be a business major. You would not come to me for investment advice or advice on which property to get. You would with Donald Trump. Donald Trump was running the country like a business where he wanted to get us back up and functional. And he had to depend upon the, quote, scientists to help him. And the problem is they were bad scientists. And
So can I make a comment on that, what you just said? So let's talk about just a quick sec, Fauci and remdesivir, which apparently his wife has something to do with. That was a solution, and it's still in place today.
No,
it's still being given to people.
Right. So, I mean, there's several things about remdesivir. First off, there's something known as the Cochrane Report. The Cochrane Report is the group of people that takes information from a variety of researchers and collate it together and say, what do we know? The Cochrane Report has done several research projects on nuclear imaging and coronary artery disease using my data, right? So I know what the Cochrane Report does, and they vet information. The Cochrane Report did a report on remdesivir. You can find it on FlemingMethod.com. And the conclusion from the Cochrane Report is it doesn't work. That's the Cochrane Report, number one. Number two, it was one of the drugs that I investigated in my clinical trial, 043494110. It's sad I still remember that number. And I measured the effect of it as a one-time, first-only drug, and its success rate was 28%. Well, if you have a drug that can make you better, worse, or have no effect, you have a 33 and a third, 33 and a third, 33 and a third. So 28%, if you're one of those 28%, you think that's a godsend because you got better. But the reality is scientifically, it underperformed chance, number two. Number three,
right.
And I also pointed this out. When you go to the National Clinical Trial website, you can see any changes that a researcher like myself makes in our protocol. The date we submitted, the date the protocol submitted, any changes, what the dates are, and what those changes are. About 7 to 10, it was like 8 to 10 days before Fauci did his notorious Oval Office, sit on the sofa, we have remdesivir speech. They changed the primary endpoints of that clinical trial, that national clinical trial, which means they didn't use the endpoints for success that they had originally set out to do. They changed them and found different endpoints that allowed them to say, we reached statistical significance. So you change the endpoint. Well, they changed that 8 to 10 days before the results were out, after all the data was collected. Well, any idiot, that's you, Fauci. Any idiot can, if you have something that's successful, change it to that and make it a successful outcome. But the problem is that was not the outcome they were going for to determine success. And the outcome they went for originally didn't pan out to be statistically significant. So again, we're getting 1, 2, 3 strikes, you're out, or game, set, match. There's 3 examples of the remdesivir fail. I can't, it's not. One of the things under HHS that I will have the power to do is to have drugs reevaluated, because the FDA falls under Health and Human Services.
So talking about remdesivir, if you were in charge at that time, would remdesivir be one of the big pharma medicines that you would have passed?
So I know you're asking that question because you want a yes, no from me, but in my mind, as you asked that question, my thought was, did anybody not hear the answer I just gave? Which is I gave 3 examples of it didn't work.
Right.
So my brain was sitting here going, okay.
I like the no answer. That's why I said what I said.
Right. So the answer, but I gave you 3 examples why the answer would have been no, this drug cannot be used for this purpose because it failed to meet anything that, less than chance is, I don't know. You come up with your own analogy.
No, it totally makes sense. So if there's any doctors listening to our podcast right now, what would you like to tell those doctors on remdesivir based on what you just said?
It underperformed.
Well, okay, perfect. That's all I wanted to know. I just wanted that reiterated. So going back to the Slovakian government, have they taken any steps to address these concerns both publicly to the people and within their healthcare system? Do you know that answer?
Yes. So they have definitively said they are not going to sign the 2024 IHR.
And for the people that don't know what IHR is.
So that's the International Health Regulations that are the rules of the World Health Organization that are a part of the UN. Okay? And the 2024 IHR very specifically, so what people say incorrectly, and this is where now my attorney hat goes on, because all 3 of these, the PhD, the MD, and JD, all 3 live in my brain. And so in this case now the JD comes out and says, when people say the IHR says that the UN and WHO is going to come in and take control of the country, the JD in me, the lawyer, says that's not what it says. What it does say is that every country that signs it has to follow the rules of it, and every country has to have a representative that reports to the WHO. And so as I've pointed out to people, if you have to report to somebody, they're your boss, right? I mean, that's how this works. So the other thing that's important is the argument that the 2024 was to streamline so that communication was effective, right? So everybody got the same communication across the world. And my comments are that, number one, there wasn't anything during these last 58 months, almost 5 years, that the WHO provided that helped anybody communication-wise with this pandemic, number one. Number two, they determine what's misinformation. Now, one of the comments that I had made, and we've talked about this briefly, is the phrase that I thought of this morning, which is just the facts, no attacks. So if you want to attack me on an ad hominem for the criminal case or all the other nonsense in my life, knock it out of the park, because I've knocked it out of the park at the Texas Health and Human Services and other documents where you can listen to my federal judge tell the attorneys the jury doesn't need to know the truth. The wool can be pulled over their eyes.
Right.
Now, if you want to call me a criminal, well, go for it. If that somehow soothes your soul so that you are comfortable dealing with listening to me, you go for that. But that means that you have defined a criminal as somebody who will stand up against Big Pharma. And as I've shared with people recently, Big Pharma was trying this number a couple of decades before I got involved with it, and they just got caught off the carpet. So they refined their approach until by my time, they were practicing, for me in 2009 with my case, the first examples of lawfare where they were saying, we're going to make an example of him so no doctor will ever attack Big Pharma. And you can see it's done a really good job, because even people that we consider on this side of the fence, with us, so to speak, attack me because I'm a criminal, right? It's gotten a little softer now that Trump's a criminal and all the J6ers are criminals and everybody else is a criminal and Tina Peters is a criminal, because people are kind of having to reassess this. I guess lawfare is a real thing, you know? And David Clements did a really nice job of putting that video together, stating that I was a man out of time because I was lawfare long before any of you heard the term. So, I knock your ad hominem attacks out of the park, but the reality is not a single thing that I have published or talked about has ever been scientifically refuted. You can say you don't like it, and it doesn't bother me because I'm more concerned with the truth. I think people deserve the truth. And so none of the information, neither one of the two books, is COVID-19 a bioweapon or Are We the Next Endangered Species, of which the PDFs on both of those got submitted to the Slovakian government on the 15th. PDFs of the two presentations and the presentations got presented. That 5-minute video got presented. None of that has been refuted. So when people say this is just conspiracy, we know the virus wasn't man-made, or we know the vaccines don't hurt you, we know is Kamala speech, okay? It is speech that doesn't tell you anything and doesn't have supporting evidence. So that's what I call misinformation. When you make a statement and you can't back it up with facts, that's an opinion. When you insist that that's reality, and that's going to be the word speech, for example, from WHO or mainstream media, that's misinformation, because my information has solid scientific facts, published research, published papers behind it. And the way this is done scientifically is you look at a paper. I review for 17 or 18 journals. You read the paper. You say, is this methodologically, did they do this right? Did they collect the data right? Did they analyze the numbers right? Did they do the statistics? And then from all that, did they draw the right conclusions? Those are all points you can attack. You don't get to say, well, that's just wrong because we all know that's wrong. No, that's not how science works. See, they tried to do this little number with Semmelweis, who was a Hungarian physician, if I remember correctly, Hungarian or Czech, where he said if we'd wash our hands between delivering babies and taking care of patients, infant mortality would go down. Well, they attacked Semmelweis. They took away his medical license. They pushed him out of medicine. He died in poverty, and less than 6 months after he died, they started hand washing in hospitals, and infant mortality dropped by 50%. So this, we all know that's wrong because we all know that's wrong, is the excuse that people use when they don't have solid science. And so the conspiracy going on here are the people that are calling others conspiracy theorists and not backing it up with facts. If you have facts, if you can disprove me, go for it. I will listen to your argument, and if you can change my mind, I will change my position. But to stand there with your opinion and say we disagree because we all know that's wrong, that's garbage. We all knew that there was no such thing as a virus that could get its genetics into human DNA before HIV. And as a medical student, in my first year of being a medical student, we saw slides of Kaposi sarcoma and other cancers that they said, but you'll never see, if you see one of these in your lifetime, it'll be a miracle. And by the time I'm a clinical student, third year, I'm seeing tons of this because we have all these HIV patients with AIDS and Kaposi sarcoma and histoplasmosis and coccidioides and infections of the brain and the lung and the kidneys. And we saw stuff that we all knew couldn't happen because that just didn't happen. We're in a reality phase here where we've gone from having infectious diseases that we find naturally occurring and we use for weapons to making those weapons and killing people.
And you know what? I'm going to make a comment before I ask the next question. In your book, Stop Inflammation Now, which is still my favorite book that you've written, you wrote about that comment. It's where everybody was like finger pointing. Nobody wanted to say, "Hey, they helped us on this research and for the
Yeah.
cholesterol and the lipids and all of that stuff." No one wanted to work together, and by golly, we are still here right now. Everybody wants to take credit. I'm going to say this. I don't really follow McCullough, but I'm going to say this out loud. He's always coming up with some type of protocol to combat COVID. Doesn't really show the research on the patients he's working in, and just kind of throws stuff out there to stick to the wall like, hey, it's going to be me first. But he's not collectively working together with even yourself with decades of research. And I just don't get it. And I wanted to make a comment on there because I think it's unfair of all these doctors who don't want to collaborate for the goodwill of the people because they're so freaking selfish on, hey, I'm going to cross the finish line first. So I'm going to do a call out to somebody like McCullough or whoever is out there listening. Like, listen, it doesn't matter how you cross the finish line, but you better damn cross the finish line together and use the decades of research that you have as a nuclear physicist, an MD, a PhD, and a JD, because they're stupid if they're not following your work or asking for your advice. That's the last comment I'll make. I'll go to the next question. So in your research, what types of adverse events or long-term side effects related to COVID-19 have you found to be most concerning, and how are they comparing with reported data from other countries, Slovakia in particular?
Yeah, I think so. Some countries don't have as good a data output as I think we do. And, the CDC, interestingly enough, provides a huge amount of data just by collecting it. And it's been very useful because it allows me to have better access. And then the virology data that I've collected, that other people have collected, I give them credit in the slides for collecting this data and allowing me to match variants of these viruses with the different vaccines when they came out, with the different measures that occurred to see what the ramifications were. What we're saying is multiple issues. A lot of it is this inflammatory thrombotic response, which leads to strokes, heart attacks, high blood pressure, diabetes, cancers, the 9 pathways I've laid out on that, miscarriages. We have seen the work with what happens when the viruses, the spike proteins, the eugenic genetic vaccines get added directly to the blood, how it turns the blood gray and causes that inflammatory thrombotic, or blood clotting in this case, response. We've seen the spontaneous abortions. We know the sudden cardiac death is a real phenomenon. It's not because people are getting punched in the chest. It's because we know, and I've laid this out in the presentations, that the eugenic genetic vaccines slow down the sodium channels of the heart's electrical system. And when you do that, and there are certain people that are born with what's known as long QT syndrome that also have this very slow sodium pump channel, it means your heart can't beat as many times in a minute because it takes longer to recover that sodium pump. So anything that accelerates your heart rate puts you at risk of a very bad rhythm that can kill you. That's what we're seeing with that. We're also seeing the cryogenic effect, which means that the spike protein causes other proteins in your body to malfold. And depending upon where this happens in your body, you get different effects. So if it happens in your heart, you end up with amyloidosis, which is another reason for why people are having what's frequently referred to as myocarditis or pericarditis, except it's not. It's actually amyloidosis, which is this abnormal protein phenomenon. And it's important to differentiate that, because if you treat for the wrong thing, even if your intentions are good, you'll kill the patient. and I've had a number of amyloid patients that I've taken care of in my life, and nuclear cardiology is how you figure out if it's truly amyloid versus you think it is. If it happens in the brain, you get prion disease of the brain. Now, some of those prion diseases are Alzheimer's, some are Kuru, some are mad cow disease. We know that this has been going on. I've reported on the work that other people did in early 2020 and 2021 that they were looking at mice models and rhesus macaque animal models showing this cryogenic effect of the brain. Dr. Kevin McCarran in Japan was, because he's a animal specialist, that's his PhD area, was recognizing the pattern of behavior that he saw. I want to say his macaque was Lucy, but I don't remember if that's the name he gave to her or not. But he had one animal model that he had induced this same phenomenon in, that he recognized the behavior. And it was this cryogenic effect. And so he's been on that since day one. He's, when it happens in the pancreas, which we know it happens in the pancreas, we have people whose biopsies were done or autopsies are done. So biopsies are your live and piece of tissue is taken out. Autopsy is you died and now the tissue is examined, where it's been done in the pancreas, and these people had diabetes. The Hamburg scientists did this back in 2020. They did the first paper on this with autopsy studies showing this inflammatory thrombotic and cryogenic phenomenon occurring in the patients that were dying. So this is 2020, right? 2020. We're talking 4 or 5 months after all this started. So this evidence was there in Hamburg, Germany autopsies. And we've seen it since. Burkhardt did a lot of this. And to see this, because viruses can't be seen with light microscopy, you have to do something that tags them. You have to find the antibody that will tag, and then the antibody gets attached to something known as horseradish peroxidase that turns brown so you can see it on the tissue under the microscope. So this stuff has been known. So again, the problems that are occurring that kill people or don't kill people, strokes, heart attacks, diabetes, high blood pressure, miscarriages, cancer through 9 pathways that I feel like I've ad nauseum done these pathways. This is another example of, and I want to go back to something here. So that diagram behind me, people have used that and said, Fleming says that cholesterol is not a problem. No, cholesterol is a problem. It's a different amount of a problem in different people. There's 17 or 18 different things up there that have to be taken into account. And they play different roles in different people. So what I see in the field where people who say cholesterol is not a topic is the same thing that you talked about that I said in the book, which is people don't want to work together. They have a problem saying, well, you know what? Maybe in this patient, cholesterol is more of a problem than in that patient, but for the person that it was a problem, it was a problem. Maybe in the other person, it's more homocysteine. Maybe in this person, it's more lipoprotein a. Maybe it's a combination. Maybe it's the infection going on. Instead of people opening their minds and saying, we care about 17 or 18 different things we should look at to address, many of which we can improve with our diet and lifestyle, some of which we may need to cover with medicines while we change the diet and lifestyle, and then work on getting you off the medicines as best we can. That's working together as a team versus this, no, it has to be this part of the equation or that part of the equation. The reason why they're all up there is because they all play a role. So that's why I wanted to stop there and give kind of bookmark the topic that I was working on. There was, so I had hit, what was the last topic that I was hitting on before I went back to this?
I had a pancreas question because you had mentioned pancreas and insulin and diabetes.
Okay, on the cancer, And I do this. That was where I was going with that. When we talk about cancer, we kind of tend to have these two separate pathways of people who don't want to. They don't want to work together. We have the conventional group that are using all the drugs that we have found to be helpful for cancers. Not 100%, obviously, because we still have cancer, right? And we've got people who want to use just the vitamins and minerals and that type of thing and go down that pathway. And clearly that's not getting answered all. And part of what I did in Fleming Method in some of the presentations you've been in is I said, listen, here's cancers. Isn't it fascinating that if we take some of the drugs we normally use and some of the vitamins and minerals that we normally maybe don't use, and we add those together, we get this improved effect, this synergistic effect where they are working together. So the reason for pointing this out is that I keep hearing this. People want to go down one pathway or the other instead of saying, how can we take both pathways and say they must have something right? They clearly don't have everything, or we'd be done with the argument, and put them together. Work on this together instead of so stubbornly separately that we've got to start finding ways to say how important we are and how unimportant everybody else is. That is the phenomenon that resonates with the treatment of these viruses, with the treatment of the consequences, with the treatment of, vascular disease behind me, or any of this. Until we approach, let's give a little bit of respect to every little piece of information we can get and work together to get the better outcome. Go ahead.
There's just so many people who really don't trust big pharma, and they're reluctant to go to their doctors, which brings me to this question.
But there are, so let me interject just a moment. I know you won't forget your question because I'm bookmarking you so you don't do it. There are good things that have come out of big pharma.
Agreed.
This is why HHS has to take the position of, let's get back to the science. We're going to dump the garbage. We're going to de-weed the garden. We're going to get the false stuff out. We're going to analyze things like they need to be done. And we're gonna do this for the American public, number one, and for the rest of the world, number two, because as I keep referring to in the book, if we're the bright, shiny city on the hill, right now, Slovakia is educating us.
Agreed. Let me go back to a comment you made with pancreas and insulin. So I know several people right now that had pancreas issues, pancreas removed. Are there ACE2 receptors on the pancreas that the spike protein could enter, or would it be more diet, insulin, and pancreas? I mean, what's causing pancreatic cancer uptick and pancreatic issues?
So the pancreatic cancer follows those same 9 pathways that I laid out. The glycoprotein 120, the pyogenic effect, the insulin effect, the P53 effect, the BRCA effect, as people like to call it. I call it BRCN1 and 2 because I know the man who Henry Lynch, who discovered it, was somebody I worked with, I trained with. And it's BR for breast and CA for cancer, 1 and 2 genes. There are, and a variety of other pathways that I've explained out there that all have different roles. So with diabetes mellitus, because there's also diabetes insipidus for people that are wondering why I say it that way, which is a water phenomenon. There are several questions to raise. Do you have diabetes because that means sweet urine is what it means, because when they first figured it out, the way that they would test the patient is they would stick their finger in the urine and taste it, and if it was sweet, they knew they had diabetes mellitus. So the question is, why is the blood sugar elevated? And there's two basic reasons. One, the vast majority of people who have diabetes have overconsumed calories, period, across the board. And their cells don't need more energy. So their insulin receptors become resistant. And that leads to this progressive increase in number of receptors and insulin resistance. And those people, which tend to be overweight, the vast majority of Americans and people around the world, make more insulin than you and I do, normal body weight. Pound for pound, they have more insulin than we do, but yet they have higher blood sugars because their cells say, I don't need the sugar, I'm going to resist it. And it takes more and more insulin to drive it in. And that's the problem that everybody knows. You don't have enough insulin, but it's not because you don't make enough insulin, it's because your cells are resistant. And you stop that resistance by decreasing caloric intake, having the cells say, wait a minute, I'm not getting glucose, and the receptors, the insulin receptors, become more sensitive, like they should be, and the insulin levels fall, and the glucose levels fall, and the weight falls. And the other one, or typically the younger kids who have autoimmune phenomenon, where their pancreatic islet cells don't make insulin. So they have too little because they don't make insulin. And that's why the blood sugar stays up. So what we're seeing with the SARS-CoV-2 viruses and the eugenic genetic vaccines, or this amyloid phenomenon, where the proteins are being malfolded, so they're not even being able to make the necessary insulin. They're looking like an autoimmune child, right?
Okay.
And that forces them to have to get outside insulin to help with that. And there's all sorts of work going on about how do we deal with amyloid, these malfolded proteins. And hopefully it's people that are reading this last book or read The Next Endangered Species pick up on one of the messages, the underlying themes here, which is that if you want to understand both the biological, viral, and other bacterial weapons and fungal weapons that are being developed, you actually have to understand cardiology, because the receptors are basically cardiology receptors. If you understand the eugenic genetic vaccines and what they're targeting, you have to understand cardiology. So where the field may be prospering in infectious disease and virology and immunology, it's only because they've learned from the cardiology community what these receptors are. It also means that the cardiologists should be, like myself, should be the ones who are able to look at this and say, I got it. I know what receptor you're going for, right? I mean, you mentioned the ACE2 receptor, but it's actually the NER5AC receptor that the glycoprotein 120 that was inserted into the spike protein of this virus attaches to first. It then goes to the ACE2 receptor. And ACE2 receptors are found throughout the body. Every tissue that has a blood vessel in it, including the pancreas, has ACE2 receptors. The other area that's very high in ACE2 receptors, besides the blood vessels, are the reproductive organs.
Interesting on that.
Okay.
Okay.
So that, and hopefully that explained that.
It did. So I've got a couple other questions before we wrap up. So we're out here in Utah, we're starting to see an uptick in these, pop up, hey, come get your boosters. They're in Park City. They're in Camas. They're all over. Drive-through clinics. Roll up your sleeve.
You're not going to ask me the stupid question of what am I going to tell people to do?
No.
Okay, thank you. Okay.
So with that said, because it's still going on almost 5 years, what would you like to tell the doctors and or the pharmacists out there who are also responsible what would you like to tell them about any boosters going forward?
Okay, so you did kind of just ask that question. You just did it in a clear way. So here's my answer. Why do you think I'm spending so much time with the government of Slovakia that is calling for a global? And one of the publications, they said, FICO, sorry, I've listened to pronunciation. I want to make it a long I, but it's FICO. And Kotler, the Prime Minister of Slovakia, Robert Fico, and the plenipotentiary of Slovakia, Dr. Peter Kotler. Why do you think I'm working with them so hard and they are making statements calling for a global ban? Do you think it's because I'm going to recommend that you give people these boosters? No. It's because there is a problem going on here. And we have been the emergency use authorization documents, 2, 3, and 51 on Fleming method, Janssen, Moderna, and Pfizer. The scientific approach to determining if something should be used is it any better than placebo? And when I ran the statistics, and it's in that book, and I've done multiple presentations, there is no statistical reduction in COVID cases or deaths among people vaccinated compared to unvaccinated. So it didn't stand the scientific test to even get approved. It does not prevent people from getting infected. It does not prevent people from transmitting. And whoever I feel like I've said this term way more times. The person, the rocket scientist who thought it was intelligent to tell anybody that vaccines prevent infection or the spread of infection needs to be shaken like one of those light sticks that you snap and shake to light up, because that's not what they do. They prime you so that when you get infected, you should have a shorter response time because you've already seen it. Well, guess what? SARS-CoV-2 wasn't novel in 2021 because it had been around for a year. And it certainly isn't novel in 2024 because now it's been around for 5 years. So if you haven't seen it already, it means you haven't been born yet. Right? And that's not a statement that says go vaccinate the newly born, boys and girls. That was not what that statement was. It means everybody else on the planet has been exposed to this. So you've kind of been vaccinated. Good old-fashioned way, whether you liked it or not. You got exposed to it. It was a bioweapon that should never have been built, should never have been released. But we've all been exposed to it. And short of the aliens landing and coming in, everybody on the planet pretty much has been exposed to it, okay? Some of the dolphins in the ocean may not have been, but give them time. I mean, humanity does a really good job of dumping garbage into the ocean, so I'm sure we'll get it there for them. And that's not a global warming phenomenon. That's a get your garbage out of my oceans, people, because I like to scuba dive and I like the water to be clean.
All right. I'm going to hold off on my last question because I want to ask you this. And this is just really coming from me as a normal citizen, not a doctor, not a nuclear physicist, just an average person trying to get the truth out on really what is happening with the toxic assault, chemical rape. Do you think that these doctors, pharmacists, who are still giving the boosters, we're up to number 5 now, could be number 6, do you think that they should be held accountable because they are also not giving informed consent? I mean, the data is out there.
So I can't speak to the motives of every human being on the planet. I can only speak to the motives of one human being on the planet. and he's questionable at times. So there's not going to be a one size fits all for this. Just like we're not going to, the reason why the 10letters.org indictment is written the way it is, you notice the last person to be charged is anybody else that's discovered to be actively involved in understanding this process, which is if we find there's somebody else, they get to be sucked into this little fiasco that they've done. There's a lot of very good people. There are a lot of very bad people, but that bad, sometimes they're bad because they're just ignorant. And ignorance breeds fear. Knowledge does not breed fear. Making people aware of things does not promote fear. It gives them an understanding. And like the taxi cab driver example I gave, or anybody else, once they hear the real science, not my opinion, because I won't give people my opinion. And I've said this before, if I'm giving you an opinion, that means you're probably one of my children, and you can decide for yourself whether you think that's a good place to be or not. But I don't give you opinions because first off, that doesn't help you. You need facts, not attacks. You need solid information. And you, I think, have a right to make decisions, but you cannot do that if you don't have facts. I mean, that's the concept of informed consent. There's this approach that you should have the right to choose whether you get a COVID vaccine. And there's a part of me that says, okay, maybe you should have that right. But the question is, why are you making that decision? Are you doing it because you're getting the information you need, or are you not? By the same token, I can tell you that I don't think it's a good idea that we allow strychnine to be an option for people to consume at the pharmacy, because it's a poison. It will kill you. And I know I would get the argument from people who believe that you should have a right to commit suicide in your own way. But I don't think that the medical community or the scientific community should be contributing to that. I think if you want to commit suicide, there are ways to do it, and ways not to do it. And I could launch into what I do with people when I'm dealing that are looking for attention, and I explain to them how to really commit suicide, and then watch their face kind of go into shock. You didn't want to commit suicide. And most people taking these eugenic genetic vaccines don't want to have the consequences of these vaccines. They think, many of them up front thought they were doing it for the right reason. A lot of the doctors and pharmacists thought they were doing it for the right reason. That's a harder story to sell almost 5 years later.
Yeah, because the pamphlet's empty.
But it doesn't mean there aren't people that solidly believe that. So I can't tell you that. I can tell you that if I'm Secretary of HHS, unless there's data that I have not been privy to, and it goes back to that statement I made, which is, if you can tell me something I'm unaware of and I can look at it and it's scientific and objective, I will change my opinion. Unless there's something that they have hidden that I'm unaware of, on day one, those eugenic genetic vaccines will be pulled from the U.S. market.
And that's going to lead into my last question. But before I do that, I just want to, it's my opinion on how I feel about doctors, pharmacists. Listen, the pamphlet was empty. They had.
Oh, I know. I showed that to people.
Yes. They had a duty to take a look at that and say, what the hell? There's nothing here. So my opinion is that there are certain doctors and certain pharmacists who should be held accountable, because you have people like Dr. Kirk Moore, who was doing what he thought was right by not giving the shot, who tomorrow in the state of Utah is filing for a motion to dismiss because he did not give the shot. So doctors like him who are being courageous, he was a plastic surgeon. He wasn't, he was interested in plastic surgery, but he was still smart enough to do his own research that he knew they were bioweapons. And he knew because a pamphlet was empty. And that's a comment on how I feel. But with that said, and if everyone listening, if you don't even know who Dr. Kirk Moore is, if you could just say a prayer for him tomorrow as he faces his own issue here in the state of Utah, Salt Lake City, just give a prayer up, a spiritual saying to him. But Dr. Fleming, let's wrap up with this. When Trump is elected as president, and if and when you are nominated in to head up the Secretary of Health and Human Services, how long will it take you to clean up all of this BS on what is making America sick to where it's leading to all these upticks in autoimmune? And how quickly do you feel in that position could you pull the COVID-19 shot?
Well, so there's several things that are making us sick. And as I may have mentioned before, I already have a 20-point plan laid out that addresses not only the drugs, the eugenic genetic vaccines, military personnel, housing, our food, the toxins added to our food, our water, our air. All of this falls under HHS. So, one example is so let me hit the one thing that you asked specifically. On the eugenic genetic vaccines, on day one, I will be asking for, is there any data that you have that has not been shared, that is hidden at the FDA, that I need to see, that will keep me from pulling the EGVs today? If they give me something, it'll take me a day to go through it. If they do not give me something, on day one, the EGVs will be pulled, the eugenic genetic vaccines. They will be gone because I will have that authority as Secretary of Health and Human Services. Period. End of discussion. But if they have something that is compelling, I will go through that data and then make that decision. On another topic, on foods, on the additives in foods, there is something known as generally regarded as SAFE or GRAS, okay? Stupid acronym, but it's not mine. People don't like FMTBDM either, so it doesn't matter. And these are additives that are added to our food in this country that there were so many that Big Ag wanted to do that the government basically said, well, okay, we're just going to change the rules and you tell us if they're safe. I'm sorry, that's the Fox Henhouse game again, which is, I'm sorry, if you haven't provided any evidence that what you've added to the food is safe for human consumption, then you have 6 months to pull it. You have 6 months to figure out how you're going to make an American product that doesn't have these items in it before it's pulled off the market. I think I'm being fair by saying, if you're a major industry and you can't gear up in 6 months to make a product that the American public will eat, maybe you shouldn't be making a product for the American public to eat. We know,
so spot on.
We know that the studies that have been done that have looked at the highly processed foods result in, when they're compared to the same foods not highly processed, an increase of about 500 additional calories per day being consumed by people. Now, over the course of the week, that's about a pound of extra calories. Why are we overweight? Okay, if I have to go any further than that, you need to go talk to your second grader, because second graders tell me if you eat more calories than you need, you get fat. Okay, it's not. I don't want to hear the refined carbohydrate sugar stuff. Okay, refined processed foods, period, across the board, independent of what they are, result in this phenomenon. And by the way, the refined processed foods have a lot less fiber in them, and we know very clearly that one of the reasons why colon cancer is a problem is the absence of bulk and fiber materials that are critical. It's also a reason for why people get diverticulosis and diverticulitis, which can be life-threatening in and of itself. You know, the outpouching of the bowels and small areas where bacteria make people very, very sick, and they end up having to be hospitalized with IV antibiotics or die. We've got garbage going in our water. We have no data that shows that fluorine added to our water source is benefiting dental health. None. Putting it directly on the teeth at the dentist's office, that seems to work. But putting it into a solution that then gets absorbed throughout our body, there's no data that shows that it's going straight to our teeth, right? In fact, there's evidence that it's interfering with some of the calcium in the bone structure of people, and it lowers the IQ of people. And right off the bat, no insult intended, people, we can't afford to lose any more IQ points in this country. It's bad enough as it is. So we have a lot of toxins. I get a lot of people that send me information on toxins, but then when I ask them to back it up with data, they can't back it up with data. And you know how far that will go with me. I will simply go, so you're making an opinion, you have no data. So the things I'm talking about, all the examples I gave you, there's data. I'm running on data. I am a born bred scientist, physician, sadly also an attorney, and I'm gonna stay with this approach. We ought to be able to provide data. We ought to be able to provide healthy products. We ought to be able to quit dumping plastics in our ocean, in our bodies. We have plastics in human bodies. We have so much plastic that we're exposed to.
Awesome.
And I'm dumbfounded by this, because where do we get plastics from? Primarily petroleum products. And we don't have enough petroleum that we have increased gas prices. So part of the reason why we have increased gas prices is we're making plastics out of the stuff we want to fuel our vehicles with. And now we put the plastics in our bodies that will slowly decay with most of our bodies in our caskets, because that's sad. And we're dumping in the ocean, and we're right back to quit dumping in my ocean.
Well, and
okay?
it's awesome that you said that, because even think about the marine life. You and I both love scuba diving. I mean, think about the marine life and the danger to that and the coral.
Yeah, you want to talk about dealing with the planet and global warming and how bad we are for the rest of the animals. Well, the carbon dioxide concentration on this planet, which, by the way, if you want to deal with it, planetary, is 0.0391%. Okay? I heard some people on a panel at a hearing talking about, well, it must be over 50%. Carbon dioxide level on planet Earth is 0.031. I know most people say 0.04, but you know me. If I've got the number, it's going to be the number, 0.0391. And less than 0.2% and all life dies off. So if you're not happy with that, what's the little Greta, whatever her name is, Greta, go plant a tree. Plant a tree and quit dumping plastic in my ocean. You want to do something about the planet, quit putting everything we drink into plastic and then allowing it to dissolve into what we drink and then putting it in our bodies, because the plastic's showing up in our brains and every other organ system of our body.
Agreed.
There's autopsy data on this.
Yep.
And there's data that shows it going back. You know, we know this is a problem. Name one good thing, any of your viewers, if they want to type right now, name one good thing that happens as a result of putting plastic in a human brain.
Nothing. Same thing like putting a spike protein.
A human ovary or human sperm or anything else, right? We're living a planet that we're toxifying, and instead of looking at the real toxic effects, we look at it and we say, well, that's convenient for me, so we're going to keep doing that one. But if it's inconvenient for me, we want to stop that. How about if we really want to take this bigger picture of the country and the planet, look at how we're killing ourselves off, you know? And one thing that I saw that I'm not happy about was this argument that MAHA, Make America Healthy Again, was detracting from the vaccine approach. Because if as a species, we're not smart enough to address both, and I already told you both are going to be addressed with me as Secretary of HHS, then we might not deserve to survive as a species. You know, if we're that dumb that we can only do one thing at a time, and we're that self-centered that anybody who talks about the other person's area of interest isn't something that we can say, it's like that diagram up there. Anybody who can't say, you know, maybe cholesterol is a problem for some people. Maybe it's homocysteine for other people. Maybe it's the two together that's the problem for people. Anybody who can't look at the bigger picture is not going to be part of the solution. We're supposed to be a very smart, creative country. And if we can get the people that have been toxifying the country in one way or another out of their positions and clean it up, maybe we might have a country and a planet worth saving. Because I have news for everybody. This planet is going to continue to survive. The only question is whether we're going to kill ourselves off in the meantime.
That's a good way to wrap up. You know, Dr. Fleming, the next time you and I are going to be doing a podcast, America could be changed forever. I know, and you know, that we need President Trump back in order for him to get his group that he needs to change America. We may not survive if Kamala Harris is in, because we know that we'll go to lockdowns. Not only our First Amendment, but our Second Amendment will be at jeopardy. So with that said, what would you like to tell the people that listen to you, listen to us? What would you like to share with them on President Trump and why he should be the president for the people?
Well, to begin with, in a month, this country is going to be changed one way or another. So if you're thinking that you can sit this one out and have no impact and you don't have to participate, your absence of participation is going to lead to a consequence that you will have to live with. Excuse me. As far as President Trump is concerned, there's not a human being on this planet who agrees 100% with another human being. So you need to look at, I would encourage you to look at what the people are trying to do and why they're trying to do it. And I, early on in this interview discussion, I pointed out that the biggest flaw that Donald Trump had during his first term wasn't what he was trying to do. It's the people who said they wanted to put America first. He trusted because somebody else said the same thing that he says, that he feels,
Right.
that they must also feel that way. And he needs to be protected this second term with people that would do the job with him and help protect him from these bad influences. I'm impressed that this man cares about this country. I look at the personal interactions that he has with a number of people. Do they photo op it? Of course they photo op it. They would be foolish not to. And the reason for that, you can't photo op what looks fake. It's like bad acting. You've watched movies that you look at and you say, oh, that was so bad. And I'm an actor. I'm also a SAG actor, which is not something we usually talk about. But the way that acting looks good is you don't act. You do you, and it looks real. Donald Trump isn't acting when he's doing nice things for people.
Agreed.
People, and you're saying he wants to make America first, and you hear what he's saying: make America healthy again, make America great again, make America wealthy again, make America prosperous again. You don't hear anything out of Kamala Harris that even comes close to that. You don't hear at her rallies people saying USA, USA. You heard them try to do that at the Democratic convention. USA. I feel in many, I connect with Captain America. As silly as that may sound to people, I look at Captain America as somebody who looked at the USA for what the USA was. He wasn't happy when Hydra took over, right? Guess what? Hydra has taken over in the United States. All these people are essentially the equivalent of Hydra. What was Hydra? Nazi scientists that took over the system. Same thing. That's what we're living in. But Captain America believes in what the United States stands for. I think Donald Trump believes in what the United States stands for. I believe in what the United States stands for. I am not happy with everything we've done. I don't believe in a lot of what we've done, but I believe in what the United States stands for. Donald Trump believes in what the United States stands for. When you think of the United States, you think of 1776 and what the United States stood for. If you're deciding who you're going to vote for, I would encourage you to vote for the person who believes in what the United States stands for and what we can do and how we can be the shining city on the hill and how we can bring the country back and represent what the world needs and stand for it. Right now, Slovakia is giving a lesson in integrity to the United States. The question is, do Americans want to stand up and have a sense of the United States once again having integrity and doing what it should be doing? Or do we want a United States that simply says, you know, we want to make things better because what was doesn't need to tell us where we're going to be, and whatever the heck the rest of that Marxist comment was that she keeps regurgitating. So if you want to vote for what the United States stands for, even if you don't like everything about Donald Trump, what you do know he stands for is the United States.
And I love that. And we're fighting for him in Utah. So, Dr. Fleming, what is 10 letters? And we'll call this a wrap.
So 10 letters, the bottom of the screen is the website that Americans can go to, click on Build Your Letter. It will allow you to generate a letter based upon your address. Now, there's a box to click to remove your address if you don't want people to know, but your address says which governor and attorney general to generate the cover letter to. In a month, we're probably going to have to update the site, right? With new governors, I suppose, being elected.
I'm sure.
Just a shout out for the people responsible for that. And then you mail in, you print off and you mail in a cover letter to your attorney general and your governor. And then you send the email link to at least 10 of your friends. So 10 of your friends will also send in letters in addition to you, and then they will do the same, and 10 of their friends will send in letters, and it will have this exponential effect so that the attorney generals and the governors know that the people mean business. Look at the evidence. It calls for them to look at the evidence. I hold the evidence, more than 10,000 documents, much more than I just gave to the Slovakians, and the Slovakian leaders are calling for investigations into the origins and an immediate cessation of the genetic vaccines being used for COVID. And they're calling for a global ban on it. They're having the courage to do what the United States should be doing. And they're not going to sign the IHR, and they're calling for a revocation of that, which will be another thing that I will call for, which is a revocation of the international health regulations, because under the IHR, the WHO determines whether the United States has a pandemic. Do you know who determines if the US has a pandemic in the United States?
CDC.
The Secretary of Health and Human Services.
Oh, that's right. Yes. And for the states too, as well. Yes.
The CDC falls under HHS.
And
the
that's
FDA
why
falls under HHS. The Secretary of Health and Human Services is the only person who can call a pandemic.
that is good to know. And with that said, 10letters.org to all the citizens of Utah. I have to tell you, we are lagging. Florida, Texas, and even California they're just running rings around us. We need your support. And write in Phil Lyman and Natalie Clausen will help us accomplish this. But we can't do it without each and every one of you. So citizens of Utah, citizens of the America, please go to 10letters.org and have a voice. You can't afford to not have the courage any longer. We are near less than 2 weeks.
And you said write in 2 names. That's not on 10 letters. That's in your election,
Yes.
right? So I just
State
want
of Utah. Yes, you are correct. So state of Utah, we need to write in Phil Lyman and Natalie Clausen. If you want to have a voice here in the state of Utah with 10letters.org, we need Phil Lyman in our state. So, Dr. Fleming, we will be praying for America in the upcoming election. Be praying for strength and peace and protection for you, for J.D. Vance, for President Trump, for RFK. We need you all to make America healthy again, to make America great again, and to make America prosperous for each and every one of the citizens of the United States. So with that, thank you very much. And I will see you post November 2024 election. May God be with you.
Thank you. Go vote, people, for crying out loud. Just go vote.
Go Trump.